The story of America's westward movement, the tread of civilized man into a virgin wilderness, has captivated generations of Americans since the final taming of the West over a century ago. It is a story that not only recounts the adventures of the pioneers rolling westward in search of a promised land, but also tells of the land they came to occupy. By the end of the 19th century, their numbers had filled the land to the Pacific, for drawn by boundless opportunity, the American nation had gone west. In the beginning, the West lay in the east, almost at the edge of the sea. For the original English colonies were pinned hard against the Atlantic Ocean, and West referred to the entire American continent. By 1650, the American settlements were prospering and beginning to grow, and as more colonists arrived from England, they began to settle farther from the ocean. And over the next 100 years, they spread their civilization as far west as the Appalachian Mountains. Then they began to spill over the mountains through a narrow, rocky passage called the Cumberland Gap to settle in Kentucky and the valley of the Ohio River. By 1750, all of the land between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi River was claimed by the English colonies. Yet France claimed land to the north, as well as the entire Mississippi watershed, called Louisiana, while Spain claimed vast tracts in the south and west. In addition, numerous Indian tribes claimed and in fact controlled most of the same lands. But in 1763, after the French and Indian War, France was forced to relinquish all her North American possessions. She gave her land west of the Mississippi to Spain, while everything east of the river went to Great Britain. The British also received Florida from Spain in exchange for Havana, Cuba, which had been captured during the war. But the British had little time to savor their American empire before the colonies declared their independence in 1776. And in 1783, most of the land south of the Great Lakes came under the control of the newly born United States of America. Then in 1800, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was able to reacquire for France the vast western part of Louisiana. But Napoleon was short of cash to finance his wars in Europe. So in 1803, he sold New Orleans and Louisiana to the United States for a trifling $15 million. At the price of about 3 cents an acre, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States and opened the far west to American settlement. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the measureless lands west of the Mississippi comprised a vast wilderness, virtually unknown to Americans, though some of it was known to Canadian trappers, who were drawn to its northern rivers by the international fur trade. In 1804, President Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the Missouri and Columbia rivers to learn what they could of this unknown region. What lay to the south and west, beyond Louisiana, was even more a mystery. The principal outposts of civilization then existing were some Spanish settlements in New Mexico and a few others in Upper California, where the Spanish had founded a series of Catholic missions along the coast. In 1774, Spanish maritime explorers had sailed up the coast as far as Alaska and claimed the entire northwest region for Spain. But other nations had an interest in the northern coast as well, for these waters were teeming with sea otters prized around the world for their fur. So while the Spanish were building missions in California, Russian fur traders were settling themselves along the coast of Alaska and Canada. In 1812, they established this outpost, Fort Russia, on the foggy coast of Upper California. But the Northwest was also claimed by the British, based on the explorations of Captain James Cook in 1778. And it was claimed by the United States, based on the explorations of Captain Robert Gray. The rivers of this vast territory were important to these countries because of the demand for beaver fur, to make the latest whimsy of fashion, the beaver hat. Both American and British fur traders were eager to control the rich fur trade, and no agreement could be reached between the countries about whose territory it was. So in 1818, the United States and Great Britain agreed to jointly administer the Northwest, an area that came to be called the Oregon Country. They also agreed to establish a border at the 49th parallel from the Great Lakes to the Continental Divide. The following year, in 1819, negotiations with Spain led to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which established the border between Spanish and American territories in the West. The line followed the Sabine River north from the Gulf of Mexico. It jogged west along the Red River to the 100th meridian and north to the Arkansas River. It followed the Arkansas west to the mountains, then ran north to the 42nd parallel, and finally straight west to the Pacific. This ended Spanish claims to the Oregon Country and set the 42nd parallel as the northern boundary of Upper California. By 1820, the Spanish missions in California had grown into prosperous ranches, producing such commodities as olives, wine, and cowhides. But commercial trade with the United States had long been discouraged by the Spanish government. Even New Mexico, which could be reached overland from the American frontier, was not allowed to trade with the Americans. But in 1821, the Mexicans were able to win their independence from Spain. New Mexico and California became provinces of the Republic of Mexico. The Mexican government opened the door to trade, and the result was the birth of an overland trade route, the famed Santa Fe Trail, which ran from Franklin, Missouri, and later from Westport Landing, 900 miles over barren grassland to Santa Fe. The trail was simply a wagon track, sometimes deeply rutted, but in other places just a broad corridor through the grass. Over the trail bound for Mexico passed manufactured goods such as cotton cloth, while traders might return to Missouri with mules and Mexican silver. In 1833, a fortified trading post called Bent's Fort was built on the trail. It was built on a portion of the trail that ran along the Arkansas River, and from its walls you could gaze across the river at Mexico. The fort was perfectly located for commerce with the Indians, who would bring their buffalo robes to the fort to trade with the white men. And it was a haven for trappers, who traded their beaver pelts for supplies from the well-stocked trading room. They could get buttons, coffee, or gunpowder. They could get a pistol or a cooking pot. Or they could replace traps they had lost. Bent's Fort also catered to the wagons passing over the Santa Fe Trail. It had shops where wheels could be mended. If a trader needed the work of a blacksmith, the fort had one. There was even a saloon where men could socialize, catch up on news from the States, or relax over a friendly game of checkers. During the era of the Santa Fe Trail, the American frontier was moving across the Mississippi River. In 1821, the same year that Mexico gained her independence, Missouri became a state. It had been preceded in 1812 by Louisiana. West of Louisiana lay Texas, which was a part of Mexico, but in 1836, American settlers in Texas declared their independence and established the Republic of Texas. It remained an independent country until 1845, when it was admitted to the U.S. as a state. Arkansas became a state in 1836, and Iowa in 1846. New farms pushed back the wilderness as more people moved across the Mississippi. Forests were cut down to build village churches. Wagon roads replaced game trails, and the land was made safe for civilized people. Some of the emigrants welcomed this transformation and settled down to a routine of domestic bliss. But others longed for the excitement they had felt on the old frontier. These undoubtedly looked down the last road leading to the new frontier and felt once again the urge to go west. Before about 1840, few American citizens had ever seen the far west. Apart from a few trappers, a handful of traders, and a small number of immigrants who had migrated to Oregon, California, and Texas, almost no one had ever been west of the settlements bordering the Mississippi River. But a few did go west and wrote about what they saw. They described the unsurpassed beauty of the land. They told of wide open spaces under endless skies. Easterners came to see the West as a kind of promised land, brimming with opportunity and free for the taking. Oddly, the right of Americans to occupy that land was scarcely questioned, even though, of course, it was already occupied. Numerous tribes of Native Americans had lived in the western and eastern regions since prehistoric times, but whatever rights these first Americans might have had by reason of first occupation were largely ignored. Still, the systematic suppression of Indian rights did require a rationale, a principle on which to build public policy. That principle was to be found in the concept of manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans, with their democratic institutions, their religion, and their industrial civilization, had an obvious God-given right, almost an obligation, to spread their culture over the continent. As early as the 1820s, expansionists had designated the Pacific Coast as the natural western boundary of the United States, even though Mexico possessed much of the intervening territory, and the Oregon country was jointly claimed by Great Britain. By then, a few Americans were beginning to settle in Oregon. To get there, they walked 2,000 miles over deserts, mountains, and canyons, without the benefit of a single road or bridge. Following trails laid down by early trappers, they marched across the open prairie, crossed the Rocky Mountains at South Pass, and struggled onward for months to Oregon City. This long wilderness track became the overland trail to the Oregon country, or simply the Oregon Trail. In the 1840s, it was the route of thousands of immigrants migrating into Oregon, or by branches into Utah and California. Attracted by free land, about 10,000 American immigrants moved west between 1841 and 1846, enough to shift the political balance of the Oregon country toward the United States and away from Great Britain. In 1846, a treaty was signed extending the existing boundary at the 49th parallel to the Pacific. At last, U.S. territory reached to the Western Ocean. But there was still the matter of Mexico. Of course, Texas had just joined the United States, but that was not enough. With little pretext, the United States invaded Mexico. U.S. troops moved down the Santa Fe Trail to attack from the north, while another force, under the command of Zachary Taylor, stormed across the Rio Grande and into the heart of the country. Before it was over, American troops captured Mexico City, and the Mexicans had little choice but to sign a treaty ceding Upper California and the entire Southwest to the United States. To finish it, the United States made the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, buying 45,000 square miles from Mexico for $10 million. And finally, it was enough. In 1848, the same year California was ceded to the Americans, gold was discovered on the American River, 50 miles north of present-day Sacramento. This strike, and others across the West a decade later, propelled countless thousands of fortune hunters to rush west and stake their claims to the promised land. On the long journey to the promised land, there was no gateway, no river, no mountain pass to mark the beginning of the wild and fabled West. Just the imperceptible passage from a landscape of trees and tall grass to one of short grass and cactus stretching monotonously to the horizon. This was an alien world to the Easterner, empty, featureless, and unknown, filled with unfamiliar plants and strange animals. Some emigrant diaries mention the peculiar ground squirrels that lived everywhere on the prairie. They barked like little dogs, so they called them prairie dogs. But it was more exciting to catch a glimpse of an antelope, an animal completely unknown in the East, or to see the magnificent buffalo which covered the land in the millions. The routes across the plains generally followed the courses of rivers. The Oregon Trail followed the Platte River, which provided a natural east-west corridor from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Some sections of the river were bounded by cottonwood trees and cloaked with grass. These provided excellent places to stop and rest. At the noon halt, the horses and oxen could graze and drink from the river, while the emigrants ate their lunch. Everyone would need a rest before beginning the long haul through the heat of the afternoon. Some of the emigrants rode horses, but many more simply walked beside the wagons. Often, the wagons were so filled with provisions and personal belongings that only the driver had room to ride. Wagon trains traveled every day but Sunday, from early morning until about 5 in the evening. They covered about 10 to 15 miles each day. When they finally stopped for the night, the wagons were often arranged in a circle so that the animals might be brought inside for protection from wolves or from theft by Indians. Tents were hurriedly pitched to give families a little privacy, as well as protection from mosquitoes, biting flies, and rain. Then fires had to be built to cook the evening meals. Typical food on the trail was beans with bacon, biscuits, and coffee. The next morning, as early as possible, the wagons would roll out of camp to start the whole cycle over. Day after day, for months, the wagons moved up the trail. By the 1860s, many were bound for the snowy Rocky Mountains at the far western fringes of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, where gold had been discovered in 1858. Settling on the plains at the foot of the mountains, the gold seekers laid out on paper rival town sites, such as Montana City, Auraria, Boulder City, and Denver City, in honor of James Denver, the territorial governor of Kansas. At first, the settlements were little more than clusters of wagons and tents, with almost every aspect of civilized life taking place under canvas. Tents that had been used each night on the journey west were simply set up as temporary houses, stores, and public buildings. School could be held in a tent, which on Sunday became a church. Among the first to rush west were the land speculators who arrived early, bought up cheap government land, and resold the parcels to people who came later. But many settlers obtained land directly from the government under the provisions of the Homestead Act of 1862. Under this law, any head of a family or any adult male who had not borne arms against the government could obtain legal title to 160 acres of land, merely by building a house on it, cultivating the earth, and occupying the property for at least 5 years. Gradually, the West was transformed as unplowed wilderness gave way to prosperous farms. But one event, perhaps more than any other, foretold the conversion of the West from unspoiled wilderness to a precinct of civilized man. That event, on May 10, 1869, was the grand opening of the first complete railroad line across the continent. From that day forward, anyone with money for a ticket could review from the comfort of a train car the land explored by the Scouts, Mormons, and early gold seekers. They could, for that matter, travel from Omaha to a business meeting in San Francisco. Of course, the intervening landscape still was largely wilderness, but all that would change in a few short decades. The land would be fenced and plowed, the buffalo nearly exterminated, and the native Indian population moved neatly out of sight. Sometime between the coming of the railroad and the dawn of the 20th century, the frontier, without notice, dissolved and ceased to exist. For the American nation, drawn irresistibly toward its destiny, had gone west. True or false? 1. The United States bought Louisiana from France in 1803. 2. In 1803, much of the West was wilderness unknown to Americans. 3. In 1769, the French began establishing Catholic missions along the California coast. 4. In 1763, after the French and Indian War, France ceded her claims west of the Mississippi to Great Britain. 5. Wagon trains covered about 10 to 15 miles per day. 6. Until 1846, the Oregon Country was jointly administered by the United States and Spain. 7. In 1650, Mexico won her independence from Spain. 8. The Republic of Texas was, for a time, an independent nation. 9. The Santa Fe Trail ran from the United States to Mexico. Many settlers headed for Colorado after gold was discovered there in 1858.